After 10 years of war, Odysseus wanted only one thing: to return home. Yet the voyage from Troy to Ithaca would take another 10 years, and by the time he reached his own shore, every ship and every companion who sailed with him would be gone. Tonight we will follow that long journey slowly, across a sea of quiet islands, distant fires, hidden harbors, and moonlit waves. There is nowhere you need to go, and nothing you need to remember. Allow the day to loosen its hold. Let your shoulders rest, soften the muscles around your eyes, and take one calm breath. The Odyssey is an ancient Greek poem traditionally connected with the name of Homer. Long before it was written down, stories like this were shaped by generations of singers. Each performance carried familiar people and places into a new evening. Odysseus, Penelope, Telemachus, Athena, the dark sea, and the small island of Ithaca waiting beyond it. The poem itself begins near the end of the voyage and moves backward through memory. Tonight, for ease and rest, we will take the road in a gentler order. We will begin when the war at Troy is over and the ships first turn toward home. So imagine the final fires of a great camp fading behind a quiet coast. Oars enter the water. Sails fill beneath the morning sky. Far to the west, beyond all the unknown miles, Ithaca waits. Odysseus, king of Ithaca, had already spent 10 years away from his wife and son when the gates of Troy finally fell. He was known not as the strongest of the Greek commanders, but as one of the most resourceful. When force failed, he searched for another path. When others saw a closed door, he looked for the hinge, the shadow, or the forgotten key. The victory at Troy did not bring him peace. It only gave him permission to begin the journey home. 12 ships left the coast with him. Their hulls carried tired men, captured goods, worn shields, jars of water, and the memories of a war that had consumed a decade. Some sailors had sons they had never met. Some pictured vineyards grown wild in their absence. Odysseus remembered Penelope and Telemachus, who had been only a small child when the fleet sailed away. Ithaca was not a vast or wealthy kingdom. It was rocky, green, and familiar. Goats moved along its slopes, olive trees bent in the wind. From the high ground, a person could watch sunlight travel across the surrounding sea. To Odysseus, no richer country could replace it. The distance from Troy to Ithaca was not beyond the strength of an ancient ship. Under kinder circumstances, the voyage might have ended within weeks. But in the Odyssey, the sea is more than water. It is uncertainty itself. Every island may offer shelter or danger. Every wind may be a gift or a warning. Human choices matter, yet the gods also bend the horizon. Odysseus believed he was sailing out of one story. He did not yet know that the greater story of his life was beginning. The war was over, but his true Odyssey had only begun. The first landfall brought the fleet to Ismarus, home of the Cicones. The Greeks attacked the town and gathered its wealth. Odysseus urged his men to leave quickly, but victory made them slow. They remained on the shore, feasting while the surviving Cicones called for help from inland. By morning, new warriors arrived. A battle spread across the beach. The Greeks escaped at last, but each ship had lost 6 men. Their homeward journey had barely started, and already the empty places at the oars could be counted. The fleet sailed south, intending to round the Greek mainland. Then a hard northern wind rose near Cape Malea. Sails strained. Waves drove the ships away from their course, beyond familiar waters and into the uncertain geography of legend. For 9 days they moved beneath the weather. On the 10th, they reached a low and peaceful shore. The island of the Lotus Eaters offered no chains, no weapons, and no visible threat. Its danger was much quieter. The people who lived there welcomed the strangers and shared a sweet plant called the lotus. Odysseus sent a small group inland to learn who inhabited the country. The men expected questions, perhaps trade, perhaps suspicion. Instead, they were offered food. Those who tasted the lotus did not collapse or fall ill. They simply stopped caring about the journey. Home became less urgent. Ithaca faded. Wives, children, fields, and promises seemed like details from someone else's life. The men wanted only to remain beneath the soft sky, eating more lotus and allowing memory to drift away. When they failed to return, Odysseus went looking for them. He found no prison to break open. His companions were sitting freely among their hosts, peaceful and unwilling to leave. He had them carried back to the ships. They wept and resisted, not because the island had hurt them, but because it had removed the very desire to be rescued. Odysseus bound them beneath the rowing benches until the shore had disappeared behind the horizon. He ordered every other sailor aboard before curiosity could draw them inland. The encounter lasted only a short time, yet it revealed one of the deepest dangers in the Odyssey. A traveler can be kept from home by storms and monsters, but also by comfort, forgetfulness, and the quiet surrender of purpose. The ships moved on, leaving the harmless-looking island behind. Odysseus had saved his men not from death, but from forgetting who they were. Beyond the Lotus Eaters lay the country of the Cyclops. Near its shore, the Greeks found a smaller island rich with wild goats. They rested there, gathered food, and looked across the water toward smoke rising from distant hills. Odysseus chose one ship and crossed with a group of companions. He wished to discover whether the inhabitants welcomed strangers. Hospitality was sacred in the ancient Greek world. A traveler was expected to approach with respect, and a host was expected to offer food and safety before demanding a full account of the visitor's name. The cave they entered contained baskets of cheese, pens for lambs and kids, and great vessels of milk. The sailors urged Odysseus to take what they could and leave. Odysseus decided to wait for the owner. To escape the Cyclops, Odysseus first had to give up his name. The owner of the cave was Polyphemus, a one-eyed giant and a son of Poseidon. At dusk he returned with his flock, rolled an enormous stone across the entrance, and noticed the strangers beside his fire. Polyphemus did not honor the custom of hospitality. He trapped the men and began consuming them, 2 at a time. The stone at the entrance was too heavy for the sailors to move. Killing the giant while he slept would only leave them sealed inside the cave. Odysseus waited and made a plan. He offered Polyphemus a powerful wine brought from Ismarus. The Cyclops drank deeply and asked the stranger's name, promising a gift in return. Odysseus answered that his name was Nobody. When the wine overcame the giant, the trapped men heated the sharpened end of an olive stake in the fire and drove it into his single eye. Polyphemus cried out so loudly that the neighboring Cyclopes came to the cave and called through the stone, asking who was attacking him. Polyphemus shouted that nobody was hurting him. Hearing this, the others assumed that no enemy was present and returned to their homes. At dawn, the blinded giant moved the stone and sat in the entrance, feeling the back of each sheep as it passed outside. Odysseus tied his companions beneath the animals. He clung beneath the largest ram, hidden by its wool. One by one, the flock carried the prisoners into the open air. The sailors reached their ship and pushed from shore. They had escaped because Odysseus had made itself nobody. Yet pride soon undid part of his cleverness. From the water, he revealed his true name and boasted of the victory. Polyphemus raised his hands to Poseidon and asked his father to punish Odysseus. The sea god could not erase the hero's promised homecoming, but he could make it bitter, lonely, and late. The man who had survived by hiding his name now placed that name into the hands of an angry god. From that moment, the road to Ithaca grew longer. The surviving sailors returned to the other ships. They divided the rescued animals and honored those who had not returned from the cave. At dawn, the fleet continued across the gray water. After many days, they reached the floating island of Aeolus, keeper of the winds. A high wall enclosed his home, where he lived with his family. Aeolus welcomed Odysseus for an entire month and listened to the story of Troy. When the time came to leave, he offered an extraordinary gift. The bag of winds brought Odysseus close enough to see the fires of Ithaca, yet it carried him farther away than any storm before it. Aeolus placed every dangerous wind inside a strong leather bag and tied it with silver cord. Only the gentle west wind remained free, guiding the ship toward home. Odysseus kept the bag beside him and held the rudder himself. For 9 days and nights, the sea remained steady. On the 10th, Ithaca appeared. The sailors could see smoke rising from evening fires. After years of war and months of wandering, home was close enough to recognize. Odysseus had not slept during the voyage. Now, with the island before him, exhaustion finally closed his eyes. His companions gathered around the mysterious bag. They had watched kings honor Odysseus with gifts while they received little. They convinced themselves that Aeolus had hidden gold and silver inside. If their leader slept while they approached home, perhaps he never meant to share it. They loosened the silver cord. Every imprisoned wind rushed into the sky. The sea changed at once. Ithaca vanished behind rain and rising waves, and the ships were driven all the way back to the island of Aeolus. Odysseus asked the Keeper of Winds for help again. This time, Aeolus refused. A man returned by such a storm, he believed, must be opposed by the gods. The fleet left without a favorable breeze. The sailors had been defeated not by a monster, but by suspicion, at the very edge of success. For the rest of his life, Odysseus would remember the night when the lights of home were visible and then disappeared. They rowed for 6 exhausting days. On the 7th, the ships entered a narrow harbor surrounded by cliffs. Odysseus alone kept his vessel near the entrance. The others moved deep into the sheltered water and fastened their lines close together. This was the country of the Laestrygonians, a race of giants. Stones fell from the cliffs. Ships shattered against one another, trapped in the harbor like fish in a bowl. Of the 12 vessels that had left Troy with Odysseus, only the one moored outside escaped. The sea suddenly felt much larger. Hundreds of companions were gone, and the remaining men sailed in one crowded ship. Their next refuge was Aiaia, a wooded island where smoke rose among the trees. Odysseus divided the survivors into 2 groups. One remained by the shore. The other, led by Eurylochus, followed a path through the forest and discovered a stone house surrounded by strangely gentle wolves and lions. Inside lived Circe, a goddess skilled in herbs, transformation, and enchantment. Her singing passed through the open doors as she worked at a loom. Circe welcomed the sailors with food and wine. Only Eurylochus remained outside, cautious and unseen. The others drank from her cup. She touched them with a wand, and their bodies changed into swine, though their human minds remained awake within them. Circe transformed Odysseus's companions, but the plan failed when a god placed a small white flower in his hand. Eurylochus ran back to the beach and reported what had happened. Odysseus set out alone toward Circe's house. On the forest path, the god Hermes appeared in the form of a young man. Hermes pulled a plant from the earth. Its root was dark, and its flower was pale as milk. The gods called it moly. He told Odysseus to carry it as protection and explained how to resist Circe's spell. Circe received the new visitor, mixed her enchanted drink, and waited. Odysseus drank, but the moly guarded him. When she touched him with her wand and commanded him to join the animals, nothing happened. Odysseus drew his sword. Circe understood that the stranger before her was the traveler whose arrival had been foretold. She promised not to harm him and restored his companions to their human forms. They emerged younger in appearance and overwhelmed with relief. The dangerous house became a place of shelter. Circe's servants prepared baths, clean clothing, warm bread, meat, and wine. Odysseus brought the rest of the crew from the shore, and for a time, the exhausted travelers allowed themselves to recover. Days became weeks, and weeks became months. A full year passed. At last, the sailors reminded their leader that comfort could delay a homecoming as surely as a storm. Odysseus asked Circe to keep her promise and guide them onward. Her answer brought no easy route. Before sailing toward Ithaca, he would have to travel to the boundary of the world and speak with the dead. Only the prophet Tiresias could explain the dangers still waiting on the sea. The goddess who had once blocked the journey now showed him its darkest road. The spell had been broken, but the way home led first into night. Before dawn, the men prepared the ship. One companion, Elpenor, had fallen from Circe's roof and died unnoticed in the confusion of departure. His absence would matter when Odysseus reached the land of shadows. The ship followed a cold current toward the far edge of ocean. There, beneath a dim sky, Odysseus dug a trench and poured offerings for the dead. The shades gathered, drawn by the promise of speech. Odysseus entered the land of the dead searching for directions, but the voice that changed him most belonged to someone he had not known he had lost. The first familiar spirit to approach was Elpenor. He begged for burial. Odysseus promised to return to Circe's island and honor him properly. Then he saw his mother, Anticlea. When Odysseus sailed to Troy, she had been alive. Now she stood among the dead. He wished to speak with her, but first he had to wait for Tiresias. The blind prophet finally appeared and described the remaining path. Odysseus would pass the Sirens, Scylla and Charybdis. He would reach an island where the cattle of the sun god grazed. If he and his men left those animals unharmed, they might still return together. If the cattle were killed, the ship and crew would be lost, and Odysseus would come home alone. After receiving the prophecy, Odysseus allowed his mother to approach. She told him that Penelope remained faithful, Telemachus was growing, and his father lived in grief outside the town. She also told him how she had died. No spear or illness had taken her. Longing for her absent son had slowly worn away her life. 3 times Odysseus tried to embrace her. 3 times his arms passed through shadow. Other spirits came. Agamemnon, whose return from Troy had ended in betrayal. Achilles, who had gained eternal fame but now spoke of the value of ordinary life, and companions whose stories reminded Odysseus that reaching home was not the same as finding peace there. He left the underworld carrying more than instructions. The destination ahead was no longer frozen in the moment he had left it. Time had continued on Ithaca. His son was becoming a man. His parents had grown old. Penelope had endured years of uncertainty. Odysseus had sailed into darkness to learn the future. He returned understanding how much of the past was already gone. The ship went back to Aea. The men buried Elpenor, raised a marker, and placed his oar upon it. Circe met the travelers once more and explained the prophet's warnings in greater detail. She described a meadow where the Sirens waited beside the sea. Their voices promised knowledge, not merely pleasure. They sang of distant events and hidden truths. Any sailor who listened freely would forget the movement of his own ship until it was too late. The Sirens did not chase sailors. They simply sang, and the desire to hear one more line did the rest. Odysseus wanted to know what their song contained. Circe gave him a way to listen without surrendering the ship. As the island drew near, the wind fell. The sea became smooth and the sail hung loose. Odysseus softened beeswax in his hands and pressed it into the ears of every crewman. Then he ordered them to tie him upright against the mast. His instructions were clear. No matter what he said, no matter how desperately he begged, they were not to release him until the island had disappeared behind them. The rowers could hear only the rhythm of their own effort. Odysseus heard the song. The Sirens called him by name. They promised to tell him everything that had happened at Troy and everything known across the earth. Their voices made stopping seem wise and continuing seem foolish. Odysseus pulled against the ropes and commanded his men to turn toward shore. The crew saw his struggle but heard nothing. Following his earlier order, They tightened the bonds and continued rowing. Gradually, the song weakened. Wind returned to the sail. When the island was far behind, the sailors removed the wax and released their captain. Odysseus had heard the irresistible song, yet he survived because he had prepared for the person he would become while listening. He did not trust his future willpower. He trusted the ropes, his companions, and a decision made while his mind was still clear. The quiet island vanished into the haze. Its music could no longer reach the ship. Another danger waited in a narrow passage. On one side, the sea opened into Charybdis, a whirlpool that swallowed and returned the water. On the other, Scylla lived high inside a cliff. She had 6 long necks and 6 hungry heads. Odysseus had to sail between 2 monsters, knowing that every possible course carried a cost. Circe had warned him not to fight Scylla. No weapon could defeat her in the few moments available. Steering too far away would place the entire ship within reach of Charybdis. The safer choice was also a terrible one. Pass close to Scylla and lose 6 men rather than risk losing everyone. Odysseus did not share the full warning with his crew. He feared that terror would make them abandon their oars. He told them only to keep rowing and avoid the whirlpool. There was no open sea around them, and no time to stop. Each stroke of the oars carried them closer to a decision Odysseus had already made alone. The water around Charybdis sank into a turning hollow. Foam and darkness circled below. Every sailor watched it, afraid that the ship would slide toward the center. While their eyes faced the sea, Scylla reached from the cliff. 6 men were lifted from the deck, 1 for each head. The ship continued forward while their voices faded behind it. Odysseus would later remember this as one of the most painful sights of the voyage. There had been no clever answer, no hidden name, no herb from a god. Leadership had meant choosing which danger the ship could survive. Once the passage opened behind them, the water calmed. The remaining men rowed in silence. They had escaped Charybdis, but 6 empty places showed the price. Some trials ask whether a person is brave or clever. The passage between Scylla and Charybdis asked whether Odysseus could continue after making a choice in which innocence could not be preserved. Ahead lay a green island touched by sunlight. From the shore came the low sound of cattle. The exhausted sailors believed they had reached a place of rest. Odysseus knew it as Thrinacia, the island of the sun god Helios. He remembered the warning from Tiresias and Circe. The herds must not be harmed. The cattle of the sun god were forbidden, and everyone aboard knew the warning. Hunger still proved stronger than prophecy. Odysseus wished to pass the island without stopping. Eurylochus argued that the crew could no longer endure another night at sea. The men swore that they would touch none of the sacred animals, so Odysseus allowed them to land. A storm trapped the ship. Days passed, then weeks. The provisions carried from Circe's island slowly disappeared. The sailors fished and searched the shore, but hunger followed them everywhere. The cattle remained healthy and calm, grazing within sight. One day, Odysseus walked inland to pray for a change in the weather. The gods sent sleep over him. While he was gone, Eurylochus spoke to the others. Hunger, he said, was the most miserable way to die. Better to sacrifice the finest cattle, eat, and promise Helios a temple if they ever reached home. They killed the animals. Strange signs followed. The hides seemed to move, and the roasting meat appeared to make sounds. When Odysseus awoke and smelled the fire, the choice could not be undone. After 6 days, the wind changed. The ship left the island, but clear skies did not mean forgiveness. Zeus gathered a dark cloud overhead and struck the mast with lightning. Wood split, the vessel broke apart, and every remaining companion was thrown into the sea. Odysseus tied pieces of the mast and keel together and climbed onto the wreckage. He alone survived. The prophecy had not described an unavoidable fate. It had offered a condition. Leave the cattle unharmed, and the crew might return. Break the warning, and the homecoming would belong to one man only. The sea carried Odysseus away from the last voices of his companions. From then onward, he traveled alone. Currents drew him back toward Charybdis. As the whirlpool swallowed his broken raft, Odysseus caught the branch of a fig tree growing from the cliff and waited above the turning water. When pieces of the raft rose again, he dropped onto them and paddled away with his hands. After many days, he washed ashore on Ogygia, the hidden island of Calypso. Calypso offered Odysseus immortality, beauty, and a life without age. He still chose a rocky island, a mortal wife, and the uncertain hope of home. The goddess lived in a cave surrounded by trees, springs, vines, and meadows. Birds nested in the branches. The air was fragrant with cedar and herbs. For a weary traveler, it appeared to be a perfect refuge. Calypso welcomed Odysseus and wished to keep him as her husband. She offered what no ordinary kingdom could provide. If he remained, he would never grow old. Time would no longer take strength from his body. The storms, losses, and years of wandering could end. Odysseus stayed on Ogygia for 7 years, but the island did not become home. By day, he often sat beside the sea and looked toward a horizon that revealed nothing. He wept for Ithaca. He understood that Penelope was mortal. Years had changed her, just as they had changed him. Home might disappoint him. His palace might be ruined. His son might not know him. Even so, he preferred a finite life that belonged to him over an endless life, separated from everything he loved. At last, Athena carried his cause before Zeus. Hermes traveled to Ogygia and ordered Calypso to release him. She obeyed, though unwillingly. She gave Odysseus tools to build a raft, cloth for a sail, food, water, and directions across the sea. Before he left, she asked how he could prefer Penelope, a mortal woman, to an immortal goddess. Odysseus did not claim that Penelope was untouched by age or greater in beauty. He answered through his choice. He wanted the life that was truly his, including its limits. After 7 years in paradise, he pushed the raft into open water. Immortality remained behind him, and the dangerous road home felt like freedom. For 17 days, the raft moved beneath the stars. Then Poseidon returned from a distant journey and saw Odysseus upon the water. The sea god gathered the clouds and broke the raft with a storm. Odysseus survived with the help of a sea goddess named Ino, who lent him a protective veil. He swam for 2 days and 2 nights before reaching the island of Scheria, home of the Phaeacians. Exhausted, he covered himself with leaves beside a river and fell asleep. The next morning, Princess Nausicaa came to the river with her attendants to wash clothing. Their voices and games woke the stranger. Odysseus approached carefully, hiding his nakedness with a leafy branch and speaking from a respectful distance. Nausicaa gave him clothing, food, and instructions for reaching the palace of her parents, King Alcinous and Queen Arete. In their hall, the unknown traveler received the hospitality that Polyphemus had denied him. He was fed before being questioned. A bed was prepared. Games and music were offered in his honor. During a feast, the blind singer Demodocus performed stories of Troy. Odysseus covered his face and wept. Alcinous noticed and gently asked the stranger to reveal his name and explain why the song caused such grief. Only then did Odysseus tell the adventures we have followed tonight: the Lotus Eaters, the Cyclops, Aeolus, Circe, the Underworld, the Sirens, Scylla and Charybdis, the cattle of Helios, and the years with Calypso. The Phaeacians listened through the night. When the story ended, they loaded a swift ship with gifts and promised to carry him to Ithaca. Odysseus boarded and lay beneath warm coverings in the stern. As the rowers settled into their rhythm, he entered a sleep so deep that it resembled peace after death. He did not see the stars turn or the dark outline of Ithaca rise before dawn. The Phaeacians placed the sleeping traveler on his own shore, arranged their gifts beside an olive tree, and sailed away. After 20 years, Odysseus returned to Ithaca without seeing the moment of arrival. Home received him while he slept. Poseidon punished the Phaeacians for helping his enemy by turning their returning ship to stone near the harbor. Odysseus awoke under a mist placed by Athena, and at first did not recognize his own country. Athena appeared in disguise, listened while he invented a cautious story about himself, and smiled at his instinct for concealment. Then she revealed the shape of Ithaca and helped him hide the gifts in a cave. The goddess changed his appearance. His skin seemed older, his clothing worn, his hair thin. To everyone he met, the king of Ithaca would look like a wandering beggar. This disguise allowed him to learn what 20 absent years had done to his household. Penelope had waited, but more than 100 suitors now occupied the palace. They ate the family's livestock, drank its wine, pressured her to marry, and plotted against Telemachus. Penelope delayed them with a weaving trick. She promised to choose a husband when she finished a burial cloth for Odysseus' father, Laertes. Each day she wove, and each night she secretly undid part of the work. The deception lasted until a servant revealed it. Telemachus, no longer the infant Odysseus remembered, had traveled to Pylos and Sparta, searching for news. Athena guided him safely back toward Ithaca while the suitors prepared an ambush. Odysseus first went to the remote hut of Eumaeus, a loyal swineherd. Eumaeus did not recognize the ragged stranger, yet he welcomed him, shared his food, and spoke with love of the master he believed was lost. Telemachus soon entered the hut. Athena briefly removed the disguise, and father and son faced one another for the first time in 20 years. Telemachus at first believed a god was standing before him. Then Odysseus named himself. They embraced and allowed years of grief to pass through them. When they could speak again, they began planning how to reclaim the palace. Telemachus would return openly. Odysseus would enter as a beggar, observe the servants and suitors, and wait for the right moment. The plan brought them toward the town along separate paths. Near the palace gate lay an old dog upon a heap of refuse. After 20 years, the first creature in the palace to recognize Odysseus was his dog. Argos had been young when Odysseus sailed to Troy. The king had trained him before leaving, but had never taken him hunting. In the long absence of his master, the once swift animal had grown neglected and weak. Odysseus approached in the shape of an elderly beggar. The servants saw only a stranger. Argos lifted his head. Years earlier, he might have bounded across the yard at the sound of those footsteps. Now, even raising his head required the last of his strength. Yet recognition did not depend on youth, sight, fine clothing, or a spoken name. The dog lowered his ears and moved his tail. He no longer had the strength to cross the yard, but no disguise created by a goddess could hide his master from him. For one still moment, the distance between Troy and Ithaca seemed to disappear. The animal remembered the man who had left, while Odysseus looked upon one of the few living beings who had known his life before the war. Odysseus turned his face aside and wiped away a tear before Eumaeus could notice. He asked about the animal as though he had never seen him before. The swineherd explained that Argos had belonged to the absent king. In earlier years, no creature had been faster. Now there was no one to care for him. Argos had waded through the war, the storms, the rumors, and the long silence. Having seen Odysseus one final time, he closed his eyes and died. The recognition was quiet and could not yet be acknowledged. Odysseus continued through the doorway without calling the dog's name. Before his wife, his servants, or the people of Ithaca knew him, Argos had already welcomed him home. Inside the palace, the suitors mocked the disguised king. Some threw objects or ordered him away. Odysseus endured the insults and studied every face. He learned which servants remained faithful and which had joined the men consuming his household. Penelope heard that the stranger possessed news of Odysseus and asked to speak with him. They sat near the fire. The husband, concealed behind an aged face, listened while his wife described her years of waiting. Odysseus offered a careful story and assured her that her husband was near. Penelope wished to believe him, yet hope had visited the palace too many times wearing false clothing. She ordered the old nurse, Eurycleia, to wash the stranger's feet. As a young man, Odysseus had been wounded by a boar, leaving a scar above his knee. Eurycleia touched it and immediately understood who sat before her. The basin fell. Odysseus caught the nurse gently and asked her to remain silent. His return was spreading through small recognitions, but the final moment had not yet arrived. Penelope announced a contest. She would marry the man who could string Odysseus's great bow and send an arrow through a line of 12 axe heads. One after another, the suitors failed even to bend the bow far enough to attach its string. The weapon that had once rested easily in Odysseus's hands had become a test none of them could pass. The beggar asked for a turn. The suitors objected, but Penelope insisted that the stranger be allowed to try. Telemachus sent his mother from the hall before the contest reached its end. Loyal servants closed the doors. Weapons had already been removed from the walls. Odysseus examined the bow, strung it without strain, and tested the cord. Its note sounded clean through the room. He placed an arrow and sent it through every axe head. Then he turned the bow toward the suitors and revealed his name. The struggle that followed was swift and violent. Odysseus fought beside Telemachus, Eumaeus, and the loyal cowherd Philoetius. Athena watched over them. By the end, the men who had occupied the palace were gone. The old home had been reclaimed, but one person still had not accepted the stranger as Odysseus. Penelope had survived 20 years by being cautious. She would not surrender that caution merely because others told her the waiting was over. Penelope recognized Odysseus with a question about a bed that no ordinary visitor could answer. When husband and wife finally stood together, Penelope remained at a distance. The man before her carried the shape of Odysseus, restored by Athena, but the gods were capable of disguises. A convincing face was not proof. Penelope quietly instructed Eurycleia to move their marriage bed outside the room and prepare it for the returning traveler. Odysseus reacted at once. "The bed could not be moved," he said, "unless someone had cut it from its foundation." Years earlier, he had built their room around a living olive tree. He trimmed its branches, shaped its rooted trunk into one of the bedposts, and constructed the walls around it. Gold, silver, ivory, and leather decorated the finished bed, but its deepest secret was the living wood that joined it to the earth. Only Odysseus, Penelope, and one trusted servant knew how it had been made. Penelope's request had been a test. His anger supplied the answer. No god imitating a face, and no traveler repeating a rumor could know the hidden root beneath their room. At last, she crossed the space between them and placed her arms around him. Odysseus wept as well. Their reunion was not the meeting of two people untouched by time. Both had grown older. Both had learned caution. The young king and queen who had separated 20 years before no longer existed. Yet their shared knowledge remained, like the olive tree beneath the house, alive and rooted through every season of absence. Odysseus had crossed the world to reach Ithaca. Penelope opened the final door with a secret only home could contain. That night, Athena held back the dawn so they could speak. Penelope described the suitors, the weaving, and the years of uncertainty. Odysseus told her the story of his wandering from beginning to end. At last, deep sleep eased the weight of all he had carried. Morning brought one final journey. Odysseus went into the countryside to find his elderly father, Laertes. He found him working among the trees in worn clothing, diminished by grief. Odysseus tested him with another invented story, but the sorrow on his father's face became too much to bear. He revealed the scar on his leg and recalled the fruit trees Laertes had given him as a child. Father and son embraced among the orchard rows. The families of the suitors gathered, angry over the deaths in the palace. For a moment, Ithaca stood at the edge of another cycle of revenge. Laertes took up a weapon. Telemachus stood beside his father. The returned king prepared to fight again. Then Athena intervened. At the will of Zeus, she commanded both sides to stop, weapons lowered. The island that had waited through 20 years of uncertainty was allowed to become peaceful. The Odyssey ends not upon the sea, but on the recovered ground of home. Its hero is brave, but he is also proud, deceptive, curious, patient, and sometimes mistaken. His companions are warned, yet make their own choices. The gods guide events, but human character repeatedly decides how each gift or danger will unfold. The poem has traveled for far longer than Odysseus. It passed through voices before it settled into writing, and through languages, centuries, libraries, classrooms, theaters, and quiet rooms after dark. Perhaps that is because its central wish remains simple. After every distraction, every loss, and every strange shore, there is still a place we hope will know us. For Odysseus, it was a rocky island, an old dog lifting his head, a father among the trees, and a bed rooted in living wood. The sea is quiet now. The oars have been drawn inside. No distant song needs to be followed, and no wind needs to be understood. The lights of Ithaca rest upon the water. You may let the story fade here, as gently as a ship disappearing into evening mist. There is nowhere else you need to go. For tonight, the long journey is complete.